Section 3.4 is called the Conditional and Related Statements. We're also doing a short intro to logical fallacies. I want to begin by talking about some equivalent forms of the conditional statement. Every conditional statement can be stated in many equivalent forms. It's not even necessary to state the antecedent before the consequent. In other words, the if part before the then part. For example, the conditional, if I live in Boston, then I must live in Massachusetts, can also be stated as, I must live in Massachusetts if I live in Boston. That's a perfectly equivalent way of stating that conditional. This illustrates the fact that if P, then Q, and Q if P are equivalent ways of writing the same conditional statement. I want to list several logical equivalents to that and sort of give you an example of each. We're not going to go too deep into this, but I do want you to see the breadth. So we start off with if P, then Q. My example sentence is, if you are a citizen of Tuscaloosa, then you are a citizen of Alabama. If P, Q, that leaves out the word then, which is very common in English. So it would be, if you are a citizen of Tuscaloosa, you are a citizen of Alabama. In other words, I'm just leaving out the then. That does not change the basic nature of the sentence, and it's still an equivalent form of the conditional. Another form, Q if P. We talked about that earlier. You are a citizen of Alabama if you are a citizen of Tuscaloosa. That's equivalent to the original conditional. P implies Q. Being a citizen of Tuscaloosa implies that you are a citizen of Alabama. Again, that's equivalent to the original conditional statement. P only if Q. You are a citizen of Tuscaloosa only if you are a citizen of Alabama. Again, logically equivalent to the original. Every P is a Q. The example sentence would be, every citizen of Tuscaloosa is a citizen of Alabama. And Q provided that P. You are a citizen of Alabama provided that you are a citizen of Tuscaloosa. In some of the problems we do, we might need to convert from one of the above statement forms back to its equivalent if-then form. So if you see any of these, you can convert them back to the original first line statement, the if P then Q type. Suppose I ask you to write every parallelogram is a quadrilateral in its equivalent if-then form. What you have to do is look back up at this chart and notice that the next to the last one is every P is a Q. So that tells me that the part about the parallelogram is the P, the part about it being a quadrilateral is a Q. So I can use that and change it back to an if-then form by saying basically if parallelogram then quadrilateral and then putting in a few words to make the sentence flow. So instead of saying if parallelogram then quadrilateral, I'll add words like if the figure is a parallelogram, then it is a quadrilateral. So it's really just that simple. You're going to use that chart to turn the statement back into if P then Q, and if it's necessary to add a few words to make it sound better grammatically, then you can do that as well. Now let's write today is Friday only if yesterday was Thursday in if P then Q form. Looking back at your chart, you can see that the third one from the bottom is the P only if Q. So that tells you that today is Friday is the P part, which is the antecedent, and yesterday was Thursday is the Q part, which is the consequent. So I can convert it back easily into the if P then Q form by saying simply if today is Friday, then yesterday was Thursday. It's a really very straightforward process. Now let's turn our attention to three statements that are closely related to the conditional: the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Every conditional statement of the form P implies Q has three related statements: the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. The converse of the statement P implies Q is the statement Q implies P. You're simply switching the antecedent with the consequent. In other words, you're switching the P and the Q. The inverse negates both the P and the Q, but doesn't switch them. And finally, the contrapositive does both. It switches and negates. So if you start off with the statement P implies Q. To find the converse, you switch the P and the Q to get Q implies P. To get the inverse, you don't switch the P and the Q. Instead, you negate both of them to get not P implies not Q. And to get the contrapositive, you do both. You switch the P and the Q, and you negate both. The converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Here's an example. What if I ask you to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the statement, if I get the job, then I will rent the apartment? Remember, the converse switches the P and the Q. In the example, I get the job is the P, I will rent the apartment is the Q, so the converse would switch those, putting the Q in the place of the P, and I would get, if I rent the apartment, then I will get the job. That's the converse of the original statement. How about the inverse? The inverse does not switch, but it negates both. So if P is I get the job, the negation would be I don't get the job. And if Q is I will rent the apartment, the negation would be I will not rent the apartment. So the inverse of the original statement, if I get the job, then I will rent the apartment, is if I do not get the job, then I will not rent the apartment. And finally, the contrapositive does both, switches and negates. So instead of, if I get the job, then I will rent the apartment, you switch and negate to get, if I do not rent the apartment, then I will not get the job. That's the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Look at the statement, if I drive you to the mall, then you will buy me ice cream. I drive you to the mall is the P, you will buy me ice cream is a Q. This is a conditional of the form P implies Q. How about, if you buy me ice cream, then I will drive you to the mall? Notice that you switched the P and the Q. Q implies P, then, is the converse of the original statement, P implies Q. Do you think this statement and the converse say the same thing? Read both statements. If I drive you to the mall, then you will buy me ice cream. If you buy me ice cream, then I will drive you to the mall. Although it's possible for a statement's inverse to be both true, it turns out that the converse of a true statement is not necessarily true. Go back to the original statement again. If I drive you to the mall, then you will buy me ice cream. How about this statement? If you won't buy me ice cream, then I won't drive you to the mall. Notice that you've negated both P and Q, and you've switched them. That's the contrapositive. Do you think the statement and the contrapositive say the same thing? Read them both. If I drive you to the mall, then you'll buy me ice cream. If you won't buy me ice cream, then I won't drive you to the mall. My guess is you would say these two statements don't necessarily mean the same thing either, but surprisingly, that is not the case. The contrapositive of the statement is true whenever the original statement is true and false whenever the original statement is false. So this is one of the places where your intuition might lead you wrong, but this is the case. A statement and its contrapositive are equivalent, and we'll use this result in later problems. And if you don't believe the truth of this statement, you can verify it yourself. If you build the truth table for P implies Q and then build the truth table for the contrapositive not Q implies not P, you will see that the truth values are exactly the same. So in summary, a statement is contrapositive or equivalent. A statement is not equivalent to its converse or inverse. Let's try some examples. Are the statements equivalent? If you go, then I stay, and if I don't stay, then you won't go. If you think of this in the symbolic form, if you go, then I stay is of the form P implies Q. If I don't stay, then you won't go is of the form not Q implies not P, which is the contrapositive of the original statement. So yes, these are contrapositive, so they are equivalent. How about this one? Are these statements equivalent? If you go, then I stay, and if I stay, then you go. Well, if you think of that first statement of being of the form P implies Q, the second statement is of the form Q implies P. These are converses. Converses are not equivalent to each other. So the answer is no. If the statements are not converses, inverses, or contrapositives, if you ever come up with that case, you just have to do the truth tables to find out. But if you do get a statement that's contrapositive, you can immediately say they're equivalent. Just for the fun of it, let's go through the truth tables to show that a statement is contrapositive or equivalent. This is sort of just for fun, so I would go through rapidly, but I do feel like it's useful to show that something that's not necessarily intuitive is in fact true. So if you start off with the statement P implies Q, P being the going to the mall thing and Q being the getting ice cream thing, if you go through the original statement, its converse, its inverse, its contrapositive, and build the truth tables for all of them, you'll see if you take the P and change it to not P, you get false, false, true, true. If you take the Q's and change them to not Q's, you'll get false, true, false, true. Then if you do the original statement, remember there's only one case when the P implies Q is false, and that's if the P is true and the Q is false. So for the P implies Q, you get true, false, true, true. If you do the converse, again, I'm going to go through this rapidly, move the Q's over and the P's over. Again, there's only one case where Q implies P is false, and that's when the Q is true and the P is false. In other words, the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. That'd be the third case here. So you would get true, true, false, true for that one. Move to the inverse, do the same sort of things. I'm going to not take this step at a time. You'll get the truth values being true, true, false, true. And finally, if you do the same thing to the contrapositive, you'll find out that the truth values are true, false, true, true. And what you notice is exactly what we said earlier. If you take the truth values for the original statement, P implies Q, you get true, false, true, true. If you look at the contrapositive, what do you get? Same thing, true, false, true, true. So we have just proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that a statement and its contrapositive are logically equivalent. We're going to include a short intro to the topic of logical fallacies. So first of all, what is a logical fallacy? Basically, it's an argument that's not valid. More specifically, a logical fallacy is an argument with an error in logical reasoning. Logical fallacies are like landmines. They are easy to overlook until you find them the hard way. One of the most important parts of college life and life in general is serious discussion and discourse, which, one hopes, leads to reasoned arguments and debate. Unfortunately, argument and debate almost inevitably lead to the use of flawed reasoning and rhetorical errors. Many of these errors are considered to be logical fallacies. There are way too many logical fallacies to attempt to introduce them all here, but we will discuss a few of the common ones. I'll just list them. We're going to go through them one by one. One is called the causal or sometimes false cause fallacy. There's one called the red herring fallacy, the straw man fallacy, the slippery slope fallacy, the false dichotomy fallacy, the ad hominem fallacy, the appeal to authority fallacy, the circular reasoning fallacy, the confirmation bias fallacy. Let's talk about these one at a time, just briefly. Start with the causal or false cause fallacy. This fallacy establishes a false cause-effect relationship. Morty says, "That drink you gave me must really be a love potion." Rick says, "Why do you say that, Morty?" Morty says, "Jessica never noticed me until I drank the potion, and now she says she loves me." What makes this a causal fallacy? Think about it. Morty made the unfounded claim that Jessica falling in love with him was caused by the potion. There's no supporting evidence. It's just something he said. The red herring fallacy. This fallacy brings something into the argument to distract from the original topic. Some people call this type of argument a smokescreen. Marge says, "It's all my fault that Bart turned out this way." Homer, "Well, you always did let Bart wear a bathing suit instead of underwear, so it is your fault." What makes this a red herring fallacy? Homer brought up a totally irrelevant fact and used it to conclude that it was Marge's fault. The straw man fallacy. This fallacy introduces a weak case or a misrepresentation and argues against that instead of the real point of contention. For example, Alex says, "Bicycle infrastructure should be expanded because cycling is sustainable transportation." The mayor says, "I disagree because cyclists run red lights and endanger pedestrians." What makes this a straw man fallacy? The mayor brings up a much weaker case, just looking at a couple of negative aspects, in order to switch the argument over to that instead of debating the original, much broader topic of infrastructure. The slippery slope fallacy. This fallacy introduces an argument that taking a minor action will lead to major and sometimes ludicrous consequences. Lois says, "Peter, please, I saw an ad for a used car that would be perfect." Peter says, "Oh no, Lois, a guy at work bought a car out of the paper, and 10 years later, bam, herpes." What makes this a slippery slope fallacy? Peter claims that some minor action, like using an ad to buy a used car, could lead to the rather ludicrous outcome of getting herpes. The false dichotomy fallacy. This fallacy occurs when someone presents an argument as if there are only two choices. Alice says, "I love cats." Bob says, "So you hate dogs?" What makes this a false dichotomy fallacy? Bob makes it seem as though there are only two choices. If you like cats, then you hate dogs. And of course, that is not the case. The ad hominem fallacy. This fallacy replaces legitimate arguments with personal attacks. Eddie says, "I'd like to tell you about my plans for improving education in our city." Mark says, "Why should we listen to Eddie? His own son flunked out of high school." What makes this an ad hominem fallacy? Instead of addressing Eddie's ideas for improving education, Mark instead resorted to personal attacks. The appeal to authority fallacy. This fallacy claims that you should believe or agree with something just because a person who is said to be an authority on the topic tells you to. Me, "What cereal should I eat?" You, "Whole grain Wheaties, that's what Michael Jordan eats." What makes this an appeal to authority fallacy? It's because you told me to eat whole grain Wheaties because you think of Michael Jordan as an authority on what to eat because he's an amazing athlete who must know all about smart eating choices. The circular reasoning fallacy. This fallacy assumes the premise of the argument is true in order to prove that it's true. It's like arguing in a circle. Beth says, "I'm athletic because I run." Sam says, "Well, what made you start running?" Beth, "Being athletic." What makes this a circular reasoning fallacy? Because Beth is basically saying that she is athletic because she is athletic. The confirmation bias fallacy. This fallacy occurs when someone is more inclined to accept a statement or idea based on preconceived ideas which may or may not have a solid basis in fact. Jackson says, "I'll read your horoscope if you believe in that sort of stuff." Allison says, "Yes, I want to know what my horoscope says. My last horoscope said that I would meet someone new and I met you." What makes this a confirmation bias fallacy? Because Allison believes that her horoscope has been right in the past, she is more likely to think that her new horoscope will be accurate. This probably makes her more likely to interpret events more favorably for her new horoscope and look hard for things to prove it correct. Just to look at them all at once, we have the causal fallacy, the red herring fallacy, the straw man fallacy, the slippery slope fallacy, the false dichotomy fallacy, the ad hominem fallacy, the appeal to authority fallacy, the circular reasoning fallacy, and the confirmation bias fallacy. We're not going into huge detail on this, but when you see a scenario, you should be able to identify which one of these fallacies best describes it.
All right, so today we're going to talk about the conditional some more. So we did some of that already in the last section with the truth tables and the different truth values. But today we're going to do more with the conditional and finally get to some of the stuff that maybe is more relevant to our everyday lives. In particular, we're going to talk about fallacies. So some fun stuff at the end of this lecture. Okay, so we have the conditional. We know that it can be written if P then Q. But in English, we can say the same thing in a lot of different forms. And so we can say if P then Q. And if we say Q if P, that's going to be the exact same sentence. You can also say Q provided that P, P only if Q, and we can say every P is a Q. So there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 different forms that you can say if P then Q. lots of different ways of saying the same thing. So you should be familiar with all of these, and I will just say to note the order of P and Q. So for some of these sentences, P comes first, and for some of the sentences, Q comes first. I also want to point out that there's a difference between Q if P and then P only if Q. So I think only if might be something that we don't hear as much in everyday conversation. So maybe a brief explanation of this one. So P only if Q means that P is true only when Q is true. Okay, and so in other words, if Q is false, that means that P must be false. Because if Q is false, we can't have P be true, because if P is true, Q is true, like you have that kind of circle thing going on here. So you don't necessarily have to pay too much attention to this, but this is mainly to reassure you that P only if Q means that it means the same thing as if P then Q. Because P only if Q says that if Q is false, P must be false. In other words, we're excluding the case that P is true even though Q is false. So it ends up being the same sentence. Okay, so that was a little convoluted, so I'm going to move on from that. Okay, so let's do an example. So they will have a few questions where they ask you to write a statement in if P then Q form, where it will be in one of those formats on the previous slide. So A, you will do well on the test if you study hard, and B, every student is a member of the campus community. So we have to identify which sentence form is this in. And for the first sentence, this is of the form Q if P. So we've got Q here and P. Okay, so there's the Q and P. And so if we want to rewrite it in if P then Q, then we're going to kind of reverse the order. So you'll have if you study hard, then Q, you will do well on the test. So hopefully if we step back and look at these two sentences, we can see they say the same thing. So you will do well on the test if you study hard, versus if you study hard, you will do well on the test. Those two things are the same. Okay, and now for the next example, this sentence is of the form every P is a Q. And so in this case, student is P, that's it. And then basically the rest of the sentence being a member of the campus community, that's your Q. So if you write that in if P then Q form, then you'll get if you are a student, then you are a member of the campus community. Okay. So again, these two sentences are really the same. If you are a student, then you must be a member of the community. That's the same as saying that every student is a member of the community. So you can expect to see these questions where you have to recognize that these types of sentences are the same as regular role conditionals. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about some of the related statements to the conditional. So we start with the conditional, which is of the form if P then Q. And then we have the converse. So the converse is the sentence if Q then P. And so what we do to get the converse is we basically just switch the order. So instead of P first, you put Q first. Okay. The next related statement is the inverse. So that's where we have if not P, then not Q. And so what we do here is we basically negate each part of the sentence, just put not in front of both things. And then combining the upper two, we have the contrapositive, which is if not Q, then not P. And so we do both things. We switch the order because Q is first, and we also negate by putting nots in front of everything. So if you're given a conditional, you can rearrange the conditional and get three different sentences. If Q then P is the converse, if not P then not Q is the inverse, and then if not Q then not P is the contrapositive. Okay, so let's do a couple examples with that. So here's a sentence. If you were born in the US, then you are a US citizen. And we want to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of that statement. So let's go ahead and do that. Converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Okay, so we've got if P, then Q. So there's our P and Q. And so for the converse, you switch the order. So we're going to put the US citizen part first. So if you are a US citizen, then you were born in the US. And we're going to talk about the truth values of these statements in a little bit. But first, let's just figure out these sentences. Next, the inverse is where you just negate each part of the sentence. So that's going to be keep the same order as the original sentence. If you were not born in the US, then you are not a US citizen. And then lastly, we have the contrapositive. That's where you do both things. You flip the order, so you have the citizen part first, and you also put a not in front of everything. So it's going to be if you are not a US citizen, then you were not born in the US. Okay, so it'll be expected, that you are able to apply the different adjustments to any given sentence to figure out the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So let me go ahead and let you guys try one next. So here's a sentence. I will rent an apartment at Pleasantville Condos, provided that the rent is reasonable. And so I'm going to ask you to write in if P then Q form, and then write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So I'll let you work on that for a second, and then we'll come right back to it. Okay, so coming back. So we have to be very careful about the order here, because if you notice, the sentence was not originally an if P then Q form. That's what we had to do first. So we first have to make sure that we put in the right form. So if we look at this sentence, I see provided that in the sentence. And so this is of the form Q, provided that P. Okay, and I am just very paranoid at the moment. I'm gonna come right back. I just want to make sure this is recording. And it is. Good. Okay. Sorry. I've had enough experiences with technology that I get very nervous. All right, we're good. So, Q provided that P. Okay, so let's first rewrite it in if P then Q form. So the second part of the original sentence is the P. So the conditional is going to be if the rent is reasonable. Then I will rent an apartment. I'm going to go ahead and maybe abbreviate some parts of the sentence. So I will rent an apartment at Pleasantville Condos, but I won't write all of that. Okay, so now we have it in if P then Q form. We have it in the proper order. And so we can take that sentence in blue, and from there, write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Okay. All right, so converse means switch the order. So if I rent an apartment comes first, then the rent was reasonable. Okay. Inverse says take the if P then Q sentence and just negate each part. So it'll be if the rent is not reasonable, then I will not rent an apartment. Just negate both parts. And then contrapositive is where you do both things, switch and negate. So it's going to be if I did not, or do not, I guess. If I do not rent an apartment, so that comes first, then the rent was not reasonable. Okay, so you first make sure that the sentence is in if P then Q form, which means you may have to rearrange the order. And after that, you can do all the switching and negating stuff. So just be aware of the order. Okay, so let me go back for a second. Go back to the previous example. Not that far. There we go. Yeah, this one. Okay, let me go back to here and just take a look at the truth values of these sentences for a minute. So let's look at this sentence. If you were born in the U.S., then you are a U.S. citizen. Now that is a true statement. So if I'm born in the U.S., then that guarantees that I have U.S. citizenship. Okay, so that's true. Now let's look at the next one. If you are a U.S. citizen, then you were born in the U.S. So if you think about this for a second, this sentence is not true. This is false. Okay, so any of you who are immigrants or have immigrant parents or grandparents, you're going to know that just because you are born here doesn't mean that you aren't a U.S. citizen. So if you're a U.S. citizen, you could have immigrated here and become a citizen. You don't have to have been born in the U.S. And that same reasoning will make the inverse false. If you were not born in the U.S., then you could still be a U.S. citizen. Okay, now for the last sentence, this one's going to be true, because if you are not a U.S. citizen, then you certainly couldn't have been born here, because if you were born here, then you would be a U.S. citizen. So notice that the original sentence and the contrapositive are both true, and the converse and the inverse are both false. And this is actually a pattern that you'll see in general, where the conditional and contrapositive are equivalent, they always match, and the converse and the inverse are also equivalent, they always match. And you can check their truth tables to see that. They're going to have the same truth tables. And in terms of why do we care? Well, sometimes it's easier to test the truth of one statement versus the other. So it might be easier, for example, to analyze the contrapositive as opposed to the conditional. Okay. All right, so let me do a couple examples with that, and then I'm going to move to the fallacies. All right, so let's determine whether the following two statements are equivalent. If it rains today, I will bring my umbrella. And if it does not rain today, I will not bring my umbrella. All right, so basically what we're looking for here, if we're looking for equivalent statements, what we're trying to check is to get from one sentence to the other. Basically, did you have to get the contrapositive? Did you have to switch the order and negate? Okay, so let's look at the first sentence. So the first sentence is of the form, if P, then Q, where we left out the then, but that's okay. And then the second sentence, you have if it does not rain first. So it's of the form, if not P, then not Q. Okay, and so here we didn't switch the order, we only negated, which is going to tell us that these are not equivalent. So this is the conditional and the inverse, which says that these two sentences are not equivalent. It's not the conditional contrapositive. Okay, so these sentences are not saying the same thing. Okay, and so if we just look at this, for the second sentence, it's saying, if it doesn't rain today, then I will not bring my umbrella. That does not have to mean the same thing as the first sentence, because, for example, it could look like it'll rain and you will bring your umbrella even if it doesn't end up raining. So in recent days to this video, that's been happening a lot, where it definitely looks very much like it's going to rain, so everybody brings their umbrella just in case. So those are not the same sentence. All right, so one more here. So we're asked to write the contrapositive of the statement and then use that to determine whether the original statement is true or false. So here's the statement. If x is not even, then x is not divisible by 2. So this is a pretty clunky statement. The more negations a sentence has, the harder it is to kind of parse what the sentence is saying. And so we're going to make this a little simpler by writing the contrapositive and then use the contrapositive instead. So for contrapositive, we have to switch the order of the sentence and also negate each part of the sentence. So that's going to be if x is, instead of is not, so we're flipping, if x is divisible by 2, because we're going to put that part of the sentence first instead of second, then x is even. So we're flipping from not to is. And so if we look at this statement, this is true. If x is divisible by 2, then that's the definition of an even number, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. So this contrapositive is true. And therefore, since this is true, that means that the original statement is also true. Okay, so you can use the contrapositive, which may be an easier sentence, to figure out the truth value of the original sentence. All right, so up to this point, we've kind of been doing a lot of dry stuff with the logic where it may not seem directly applicable to stuff we're doing in our everyday lives, but I promise it is actually useful, and maybe we're going to do some of that today, because we're going to talk about logical fallacies. Okay, so let's give a quick definition. So logical fallacies are commonly made errors in reasoning. So we've been talking about logic, all the truth tables and stuff, and recognizing different sentence forms. Now we're going to talk about the mistakes, the errors in logic. And it is really important, especially in today's day and age, that you recognize these fallacies so that you don't get fooled, and so that you are able to, adequately defend your own arguments. Like if you believe something to be true, you're able to justify why you believe that thing. So today, information is shared so quickly that it's just really important to be able to recognize whether the information is good or bad. And so as we're going through these slides, more than taking notes, it's kind of just important to think about fallacies that you may have observed in your own experiences, so you have something to hold on to. Okay, so I've got 9. Yeah, I've got 9 different fallacies, and so on your homework, you're going to have like multiple choice questions where you have a scenario, and I ask you to identify the fallacy. So, first one is probably the most common, and it's ad hominem, which is really just a fancy way of saying mudslinging. So the definition of ad hominem is that it is an insult. And it's an insult that's based on sort of maybe or not necessarily superficial things, but it's person's appearance, for example, background of any form, just any kind of background. Maybe it's an insult based on their character, etc. And so the idea is that if you use ad hominem, then you're making some kind of personal attack, which may or may not be true. But the bad thing is that it is intended to act as evidence against the other person's point of view. So it's not so much that it's bad to make an insult, which it is, but logically speaking, it is not okay to insult somebody and have that be reasoning against what they believe, because, contrary to common belief, good people can have incorrect beliefs, and bad people can still be correct in some of their beliefs. Another form of ad hominem is to have sort of the "you're doing it too" kind of thing. So, for example, your roommate might tell you that you should wash the dishes in the kitchen so that the kitchen isn't messy. And you could say, well, you never wash the dishes either, so why should I? And that's not really an argument against the fact that you should still wash your dishes. That's just trying to bounce it back to them, which is not a legitimate argument. Okay, so a couple examples here. And I'm going to preface this by saying I am not trying to espouse any particular point of view. And so for any of these contentious things, I am putting one example from each side. So here's an example from Donald Trump's Twitter account. So he says, lightweight choker Marco Rubio looks like a little boy on stage. He's not presidential material. So notice all he said is that Marco Rubio is a lightweight who looks like a boy, has not really made any particular substantial comments about anything about Marco Rubio's policies. So this is not anything against Marco Rubio. You can't use that as an argument. And then on the flip side, Trevor Noah, this is on his talk show, and he's saying, every time you tweet with those fat little tiny fingers of yours, you should say thank you to them for giving you the phone, I guess, that let you make the tweet. So at least with this sentence taken out of context, Trevor Noah has not made any criticism of what Donald Trump is saying. He's more just saying that Donald Trump has fat, tiny little fingers, which is, again, whether it's true or not is irrelevant. It's just the fact that you can't use that as a logical argument. So we do this all the time where, especially if we're mad, we just start insulting each other, which is not necessarily very productive. Okay. All right. So second fallacy is the straw man fallacy. So this is where you create an overly simplified or misrepresented version of someone's argument. So you break it down into something that's really simple, doesn't really represent what the person says. And then, instead of addressing the original argument, you refute like the easier one. So, basically, what this is saying here, this is the origin of the name. So by something overly simplified, what you do is you create an argument that's made of straw. It's really flimsy. So you rephrase the argument into something really flimsy, and then that argument is easier to attack than the original argument that the person was making. So straw man means you sort of repackage the argument into something that isn't what the person originally said. Okay, so again, examples on both sides. So let's say that a conservative is talking about climate change, and they say that they think most of the proposed regulations to reduce carbon emissions are unduly burdensome for businesses and ineffective. They don't work. And let's say a liberal turns around and says, you're prioritizing big businesses over the environment and denying that climate change is a real problem. Okay, so the liberal is not saying anything that the conservative really said. So the conservative just said they don't think that the regulations work. They did not say that they don't think climate change is real. But if you just look at what the liberal says, it's like, wow, the conservatives being so unreasonable. But really, they've just ignored what the previous person had actually said. And on the flip side, so climate change is kind of more of a left issue, and gun control is more of a right issue traditionally. So let's say a liberal says, I think the U.S. should institute a ban on owning assault weapons. to curtail some of the mass shootings. And a conservative says, so, you think we should take away all people's guns and abolish the Second Amendment. Now, the conservative is, again, not addressing the actual argument that the liberal is making. They're just trying to make some more ridiculous-sounding argument that's easier to attack. So, in both of these cases, the second person is not addressing the actual issue. So, if you have an argument to make, address what the person has actually said. Don't try to change it into something that's easier for you. Okay. So again, I encourage you to be thinking about things that you have seen in your own experience, because I can almost guarantee that all of you have seen these at some point or other. Okay, so next one is appeal to authority. So this is what it sounds like. So it's over-reliance on those in positions of authority. Now, those people could be actual authorities, they could be experts, or they could just be like your favorite Hollywood actor or musician or something else. So more and more celebrities are kind of using their social influence to step in on current events and such. And of course, experts are too. And so what this is saying is that it's okay to have, like scientific evidence, have scientists and those kinds of people be backing up your beliefs and your opinions. But what this is really getting at is that your argument, it shouldn't solely be that just someone else said so. So you shouldn't just refer to what somebody else said as evidence for your own beliefs. You should be able to make the argument as well. So you don't want to over-rely on people in either assumed authority or actual authority. So here's a classic example. This is an old ad of physicians recommending cigarettes. So physicians are doctors. They are people in medical authority. And yet, here's this ad saying that doctors think that cigarettes are great for you, which is obviously not what people really believe today. But this is an old ad, it's back in, I guess, the 50s or something. And this ad is relying on people in authority to make an argument about cigarettes. Whereas in reality, if you, look at current medical evidence and such, cigarettes are not very good for you. So that's a pretty classic example of appeal to authority. Okay. All right, so we've got ad hominem, straw man, appeal to authority. So next, let's look at false dichotomy. So again, kind of what it sounds like. So false dichotomy presents only two positions or solutions for any issue. And the option that you disagree with is presented as extreme. And once you reject the extreme thing, you only have the preferred option left, which presumably is what you wanted people to accept. So, most issues today are very complicated. There's a lot more than just two sides. But what you can do is boil it down into two very simple, black and white kind of sides and say, well, this one is obviously bad, therefore my opinion should be what you accept. So as an example of that, here's another ad. And so it's rather stark contrast. Who would you rather see live? So this is an animal testing kind of ad. And so it's saying, do you want the rat to live or do you want her to live? Those are the only two options. If you want her to live, as you obviously should, you should prefer a human child to a rat. If you want her to live, that means you must accept animal testing. And if you want to protect the rat, if you want to protect animals, that means that you're dooming all children to die. Okay, so again, animal testing is a complex issue. It's not as easy as just saying, if the rat lives, then the girl has to die, and vice versa. So be careful of those black and whites. It's really easy to miss those unless you're listening carefully and realize maybe it's not just A or B. There might be a C, or lots and lots and lots of different options. Okay. All right, so circular reasoning is next. This one's a little tricky. It's especially difficult to find examples. It's slightly, there's some subtleties here. So this is using the conclusion of your argument to support your conclusion. So you assume that the thing you're trying to prove is true, and then use that to show that the thing is true. You kind of go in a circle. And so here's an example. So we know that blank, just insert some event, happened because CNN said that 100 people saw it happen. If you have 100 witnesses, that means that it must have happened. Okay, so CNN said that 100 people saw it happen. Well, somebody might say, well, how do you know that there were actually 100 witnesses? Maybe there weren't. You can say, well, I know that 100 people saw it happen because that's what they reported on CNN. Okay, so you're kind of assuming here that CNN is valid, which maybe it's not. Or maybe they're just mistaken. So you use CNN in kind of both sides. You say CNN said that 100 people saw it happen, therefore the event must happen. And we know that there were 100 witnesses because that's what they reported on CNN. Okay, so maybe something that's a little more relatable to you would be Facebook. So this is, circular reasoning is kind of like sharing an article on Facebook. So this happens all the time where we see some viewpoint that we agree with, and we see an article, I'm like, wow, I can't believe that happened, and you share it all over the place. And then if anybody asks you that it's, is this actually real? What is this article legitimate? You can use the fact that it is highly shared as evidence that it is true. Okay, so this doesn't work. You can't do this. So you can't say that, you can't share an article all over the place and then say that since it's been shared so much, that must mean that it's true. And yet this is, again, something that we do a lot. We find the articles we like and share them, and maybe we don't really actually read too much into the article to figure out whether it's true or not. So here's a Dilbert example. So what is the key to success? It's to hire the right employees. And how do you know you hired the right employees? Because the business is successful. Because the business is successful. And so the key to success is circular reasoning. Because the key to success is to hire the right employees, and they're right if you were successful. So there's an example of circular reasoning, which again, very difficult to find for whatever reason. Okay, I've just got 4 more. I'm doing this video all at once, and for some reason it's making my voice go, so we're almost done here. Okay, so slippery slope. This is assuming that a relatively benign first step will inevitably set up a chain reaction to disaster. And so this is kind of like your bad day. So for example, if you forget where you left your keys, or if you forgot to bring your coffee with you, or you forgot to lock the door, so you have to double back. Should all of those little things really lead to the fact that your entire day is just lost forever? Okay, so here's an example of slippery slope. So if you lose your pen, then you don't have a pen, which means you can't take notes, which means you can't study, which means you're going to fail, which means you won't get your diploma, which means you won't get your job, etc., etc., etc. And in the end, you become sick and you die. Okay, so obvious slippery slope. If you lose your pen, it's not the end of the world. You can just use a pencil. Find a pen from a buddy or something. But again, in politics, we can say that if we do this one little thing, then it's going to lead to this slippery slope, and therefore we shouldn't do the thing that we suggested at the start. Again, I'm sure you've heard these things. And the point of all this is just so that you recognize that those are not legitimate arguments. And also so that you don't make those arguments yourself. Okay. Alright. So red herring is next. So red herring is where you use a distraction to deviate from the current topic and get into easier territory. So if you've watched any of the presidential debates, it happens all the time. Somebody asks a tough question and the person responds and they're not even close to answering the question. They just change the topic entirely. So red herring is where if at first you don't succeed, then change the topic. Okay? So red herring is where you introduce a red herring, where you introduce some distraction and just try to get away from the thing that's not going very well for you. So if topic A is something that you're arguing about, and then you realize that your opponent's kind of winning, then you just sort of switch gears and talk about topic B and hope that they don't notice, which a lot of times people don't. So here's an example from my favorite comic, Calvin and Hobbes. It's my absolute favorite comic. I read it all the time as a child. So Calvin says, "Dad, can you get the ball out of the gutter again?" And his dad is annoyed because he's had to do that all afternoon. And Calvin says, "Well, relax, it's just a ball in the gutter. It's not as if I've been embezzling money or killing people. This is way better." And so it always helps to establish the proper context. Okay, so Calvin was in the wrong. He shouldn't have been, playing in the wrong place. But if you just distract and go to something completely different, then it kind of helps his case where he's not going to get in as much trouble. So, red herring equals distraction. Change the topic. Okay? So I realize this is kind of a lot of information all in one lecture, but hopefully it's kind of interesting. I like the fallacies. So I've just got two more. So causal fallacy is where you inappropriately attribute cause without sufficient evidence. So you assume one thing causes another. So this actually has two forms. So one form is where you assume that because two events occur together, one causes the other. So if two things happen at the same time, one has to have caused the other. So here's an example of causal fallacy. So let's say children with big feet read better. This is actually true. If you do a study, you can find that children with big feet do read better. And so, that must mean that large feet improve reading. Now, if we look at this, we can probably figure out that that doesn't sound like it should be true. But it actually is that children with big feet read better. But we know instinctively that it shouldn't be the fact that large feet improve reading just because children with big feet read better. And so the missing link here is that children who are older have larger feet. And being older means having more experience and therefore better reading. So just because you have big feet and better reading, that doesn't mean that big feet causes better reading. And then similarly, causal fallacy could come in the form where you assume that event 1 causes event 2 simply because one of them happened before the other. So an example of this would be if you say that the rooster's crow causes the sun to rise. So the rooster crows before the sun rises, but of course that doesn't mean that the rooster scientifically actually causes the sun to rise. They just happen to occur sequentially. Okay, so just because two things happen together or one happens before the other, that does not mean that one causes the other. So, couple examples of causal fallacy. I wish they didn't turn on that seatbelt sign so much. Every time they do, it gets bumpy. Well, of course, the seatbelt light is not causing turbulence. It's just, with the turbulence, you turn on the seatbelt sign because you need to sit down. So, in the child's mind, they might assume that the seatbelt light is what causes the turbulence. And another example, I don't actually really like Dilbert that much, but because it's such a sort of cynical comic strip, it has good examples for fallacies. So someday I want to get married because studies show that married people are happier, which I believe studies have actually shown that. And Dilbert says, well, a smarter interpretation is that no one wants to marry an unhappy person. And so being married doesn't cause you to be happier. It's just that only the happy people actually ever get married, is the idea here. Now, I'm married and I'm very happy, and I think that being married has made me happier, but, you know, it is a legitimate point that maybe it's just, if you're a really unhappy person, then nobody wants to be around you or something. So, there's always multiple facets to these social issues. Alright, I've just got one more. Confirmation bias. So, really, really, really common for political stuff. So this is where you only search for or favor the information that confirms what you already think. So you dismiss all the stuff that you don't like and then favor the stuff that you do like. So this is, for example, with political views, this would be if you only consume one news source, for example. So you identify more with the right, for example, and therefore you only watch Fox News, or you identify more with the left and you only watch MSNBC. So we have this unfortunate thing now that we can very easily create echo chambers for ourselves where we only ever hear the things that we agree with, which is not very healthy. So you want to make sure that, especially for really important social issues, that you inform yourself on both sides. So you should look for articles that agree with you, and also try to look at the other side and see if you can understand that side too. Maybe a less serious example of this would be horoscopes, that kind of thing. So if, for example, you read the description of yourself using the Chinese calendar with the animals. So if you were a dog, you could read this description of your own character, and you might read through this and ignore all of the traits that you don't have and latch onto, for example, the thing that says they make excellent leaders, and say, well, you know what, I'm a really good leader, so this thing, it must be true, it knows me so well. And then ignore everything else in this list that doesn't actually describe you. So this is an example of confirmation bias, because we instantly look for the thing that matches our personality and then ignore all the stuff that doesn't, and use this as evidence that the Chinese zodiac actually works, which you may have your own views about whether it's true or not, and it's always fun, but that's just an example of looking for the things that you want to see. Okay, so that was a very long list. And so what I'm going to leave you with is that I just encourage you to think of times that you've come across these fallacies. Maybe think of the times that you've used those fallacies, if you've used them in your own arguments, and just try to be more aware of them and try to avoid using them as much as humanly possible. And hopefully that will be a good real-world application of this logic stuff that we've been doing. All right, so that's the end of that section, so I am going to stop there.